the relevant executive committee of the IAU and also of the relevant advisory committee for the European Astronomical Society. And beside that, Jake has also run a global STEM education NGO for 5 years in between doing his PhD and coming back to an astronomical institute. His astrophysical expertise is black holes and radio galaxies, which may explain partly why, of all the places in the Netherlands, he might have landed in Groningen. Although I guess black holes is one of the things that we all have some involvement with. And Jake is going to talk to us about one of those somewhat heavy topics in the discussion between people deeply involved in EDI and those not, namely the P word, the troubles and tribulations of privilege. Note the spelling. So Jake, I give you the floor.
I changed the spelling today too. That's one thing we decided was no one can spell privilege, so that's a good start. Sorry, I'm also running our technical stuff, so I just have to click some things. When we have strange delays, it's just because I'm clicking stuff. So welcome everyone. I hope in this talk as well that we'll be able to have some interaction and back and forth, so there'll be lots of times to contribute and chat and discuss things as well. And as Ralph said, we'll talk about the P word, privilege, and the troubles and tribulations of privilege. And also another subtitle is EDI fragility among scientists. I'll explain what that means as we go along in the talk as well. This topic obviously has a lot of baggage from a lot of different sides. So I hope during the talk, this can be a safe space. People can feel free to interact in whatever ways, and we can have discussions about these issues in a full and frank way and share appropriately thoughts and feelings on all of these issues, but understanding that from every side of this discussion, there is a lot of baggage involved, a lot of concerns from people, a lot of trying not to get into trouble, getting into trouble, all of that sort of stuff. Because when we're talking about these issues, it can come down to that. And I also mentioned the part about fragility, which is something possibly worse than telling someone that they've got privilege, is telling them that they're fragile. But this sort of comes, there's this book called White Fragility that's a good read on this background, about which says why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism, and how flipping that around, that it can be very difficult at times for white people talking about racism, because you're always coming from the perspective of the color of your skin when you're talking about it as well. And the same can happen with every other underrepresented group. So here, throughout the discussion, we should be thinking about why is it so hard for scientists from non-underrepresented backgrounds to talk about these EDI issues? So why do people who are white, male, senior Western European scientists often find it so hard to have these conversations about EDI issues, which is exactly along the same lines of the position that you have to put yourself in to have the conversations. So hopefully we'll discuss this and get to some things. A lot of times we hear things like check your privilege, when really you should be saying to people, check your fragility. But if you're telling either of these things to somebody, then it doesn't initiate a positive internal response. And so another thing to think about during here is how we can collectively as a community think about having these conversations while not making people feel a set of negative emotions about it, or with no prospect of how to handle or deal with those emotions and turn them into positive outcomes. So is the P word, privilege. So this is sort of going through, I've got these 5 different tales, but there's sort of 5 different sections that we can talk about things. And with starting off with the unfortunate history of words, and this is probably the history of how people learn the word, also the history of the word in general. And when it comes to privilege, a lot of words that we use when talking about these equity, diversity, and inclusion issues, we use a lot of words and everyone uses different words in different ways, the different words for the same thing, the same word for different things. And so this can get into this whole word salad mess of what we mean by words. Here's an example of the word privilege in use. For if you could get this Air Canada rewards card, which offers you infinite privilege. So this is apparently the best thing to have in the world. So, but that's an example of maybe an unearned privilege, an earned privilege. How did you get this infinite privilege, and what did you end up with to get there? And when we're in primary school, our primary school teachers want to tell you things about rights, responsibilities, and privileges. And usually what we're doing there is talking about earned privileges, so that you have your set of rights that you always get no matter what. You have your responsibilities that you have to do, especially teachers do this in their primary school classrooms to say these are your responsibilities in class. And if you fill your responsibilities, then you get these privileges. And this is how a lot of us growing up, especially if you're growing up with in English language, that you learn the word privilege comes from this chain of events, and that these, what we mean by privilege is something that you earned and something that you did something for. But generally in EDI, we're not talking about the same kind of privilege. We're talking much more about things that you may have inherited or are to do with your actual life and situation in general. So you can always think about things in terms of these rights and responsibilities and privileges. And this statement, though, responsibilities and privileges go hand in hand, we can think about that a lot and say, okay, we're saying responsibilities and privileges go hand in hand. And really the problem breaks down when we have these privileges and we're not doing anything about the responsibilities that come with those privileges. So you can, I think, hear and start seeing where the situation happens where you have privileges that you haven't earned by completing responsibilities but already had, and then thinking about what responsibilities you have once you've got those privileges, and whether, in what way do you have those responsibilities, because they're not sort of your assigned duty when you've got this privilege. So you can think about privileges there in those ways, like inherited privileges or unearned privileges or undeserved privileges. And then we start getting into the also complexity of language, and psychologists tell us how these different words make people feel, like an unearned privilege. So for example, the color of my skin is an unearned privilege. I didn't do anything to do it. It was an inherited privilege, as I inherited it from my parents. Whether it's deserved or not is then a matter of question, but it was nothing to do with anything that I personally did in my life to have that privilege. So it can become very complicated in this way. And the emotions that you have about those words can be very strong as well. Like if you tell me that I've got this unearned privilege, it already starts sounding to me like I did not deserve to have this privilege. Maybe I didn't, maybe I did. I don't think there's any deserving value on it. I think there certainly is. It was inherited, therefore it was an unearned, but then can you describe it as undeserved or not? And then you start feeling that the person you're speaking to, or the person talking on the other side of this fence, may be feeling like you have this undeserved privilege for some reason and you didn't deserve it. And that can connect back to that responsibilities and privileges go hand in hand. So if I've got this privilege, what should I then feel responsible for as a consequence of it? And what should I do? So we'll talk a lot more about those things as we go through. There's also your dictionary definitions of privilege. Merriam-Webster, right or immunity granted as a particular benefit, advantage, or favor. Oxford says having special rights, advantages, or immunities. Cambridge, an advantage that only one person or group of people has, usually because of their position or because they are rich, an opportunity to do something special or enjoyable. Or dictionary.com, a right, immunity, or benefit enjoyed by a particular person or a restricted group of people beyond that of most. But these dictionaries also define white privilege as a separate phrase in every case. So Merriam-Webster say that white privilege, if you use that in particular, is a set of social and economic advantages that white people have by virtue of their race. Oxford, inherent advantages possessed by a white person on the basis of their race in a society characterized by racial inequality or injustice. More baggage in that sentence. Cambridge, the fact of people with white skin having advantages in society that other people do not have. And dictionary.com, the unearned, mostly unacknowledged social advantage white people have over other racial groups simply because they are white. So there, when we start doing that, there's already various ways that this extra baggage has been packed into these definitions of what you mean by white privilege. You can do the same with male privilege. You could do the same with straight person privilege. You could do the same as you go through with all of those different things, thinking about what it is. And I think the Cambridge definition, the fact of the people with white skin having advantages inside society that other people do not have, is sort of defining that, okay, that's what the definition is. It's true, people with white skin have advantages that other people do not have. But then we have to decide how to deal with that privilege, and also understanding that, as in the dictionary.com definition, the unearned privilege is part of the problem there, that you have these privileges that are not earned, but they're also immutable privileges, right? I cannot give away a lot of these privileges that I have. If my privilege happens to be a lot of personal wealth, then sure, I can start giving that away. But the privilege of the color of my skin, I can't give away. The privilege of my maleness, I can't give away. So even though I didn't earn it, I also can't reject it and say, okay, I'm not being white male anymore. So therein comes another problem when we're talking to people about those kind of issues and those things going hand in that way to form how this collects in people's minds of what the problem is. So I don't know if anyone had any thoughts or discussion on these definitions of words or that problematic baggage that comes with it from your own experience or otherwise. Jason, raise your hand. Jason.
Oh yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well, one example of an interesting dimension in this is also, like, if you consider, for instance, like the United States, where there are a lot of like white people who are very low socio-economic class, don't live in cities, they live in rural areas, and they feel hard done by as well. And that's an interesting like perspective on this topic, right? Because on one hand, they feel like they should be guilty for the privilege they have for being white, and on the other hand, they feel like they have a lot of disadvantages compared to people who live in cities and who are richer as well. So I just wanted to bring it up as an interesting dimension to this problem as well.
And so a very good example of that, for instance, is in most Western European countries, that the worst performers in education are working class white boys. And they do worse in education because of exactly that dimension of factors, that them being white and male means that they get less attention, but it actually turns out that the working class and low income socio-economic problem gives them more of a problem for their educational attainment. And Tana.
I just wanted to note that you said that, you made your example of certain privileges you can't give up and can give up. And you talked about your maleness, and I assume you mean your gender and not your biological maleness in that context?
My biological maleness, I suppose.
Yeah, because I just wanted to clarify, because of course you can change your gender and give up your gender privilege. So that's something that comes with its own set of interesting repercussions for changing such an outwardly facing privilege for becoming then a marginalized gender. It's also just like Jason said, like another thing to add to this. So there's this confluence of privileges and how they add up as well, the intersectionality of that makes this such a difficult conversation, but I think you're doing well so far.
Yeah, and I said in my bio that went out with the announcement in there that I use they, them pronouns all the time. And that's partly for that reason, that I don't feel a need to express my agenda when I'm having any conversation with people. I don't feel I need to be expressed, though it has been told to me in the past that this is actually that I should check my privilege when saying that, because in fact that I'm only because I'm male do I feel comfortable that I don't need to identify myself as male. So again, yeah, that has a complicated, messy intersection between all of those things. So let me find where I want to be. Yeah, and so thinking of there's that baseline definition that came out of those things we looked at, come down to this: people who are rich, come from a high social class, or belong to a particular race or gender, can be where this general set of this unearned inherited privilege comes from overall, and can be, as Tana was saying, a combination of all of these things, a lot of these backgrounds coming together, where everything has come from. And really then, how do we deal with that on an inside and outside point of view? And historically, we can say things like the Enlightenment that failed, which is the title of many, many books about the Enlightenment period. And so historically, in at least Western European and then later in North American history, that a group of white men, as pictured here, grouped together to decide that they were being mean to everyone else. And so then during the Enlightenment period was when people started having these thoughts about human rights, how to implement that, how that should be implemented around the world, things like abolishing slavery, all of that stuff, which all sounded good on paper, but didn't necessarily come down to actually removing the differences that these inherited privileges still had in many, many places around the world. It's very, very difficult to make those changes. It's certainly very, very difficult for the group as pictured here to make those changes, because they've obviously been part of this very, very privileged group and are trying to make that privilege less extreme across society, but ended up not really doing it extremely successfully, with repercussions still more than 100 years later. So was not a mission in success. So this is why so many people write books about how the Enlightenment failed, because you didn't make this society where everyone is equal. And you can think about things very much like in George Orwell Animal Farm, where you have all animals are equal, and then becoming, yes, but some animals are more equal than others. And so it's very easy, as Orwell pointed out, to drift into that second category too. So even though the Enlightenment era was about this change, it was not actually about releasing any of that power and privilege, though was more about extending people more of their basic rights, more of their basic human rights were increasing. But from the top side down, this was still done by white male-led government. But even when that doesn't happen, interesting things happen. So as Ralph said, I ran a non-profit organization for a long time, and one place where we worked a lot was in Liberia in West Africa. And Liberia has a very interesting history around Enlightenment era of its foundation. So Liberia was founded by former slaves from the US who returned to West Africa and then set up this country. When you go to Liberia now, there is still a very distinct class system, with the higher class being the descendants of the returned slaves who had had this life in the US and came back and founded the country, and are now in this more elevated group compared to the people who were still native in Africa at the time, who then became this second group. So this is an example of this ongoing dynamic that happens everywhere during these kind of situations, and it shows how this problem is inherent everywhere, and it's not necessarily about the white maleness of the world, but also because everyone who has this privilege that goes, unfortunately, to these returned and were like, this is our idea of freedom, and have found this new country. We're calling it Liberia, which is all about freedom and democracy. We're making our new flag, which also they will tell you historically is not at all related to the US flag, though if you look at the flag, you can make your own decision about it, but have their own reason for their flag, and how that this was happening then in West Africa and still happens today in that same scale. So and still persists going forwards. And so you have the same thing with this privilege as you're trying to break down those barriers, that it's extremely hard to break it because of the whole tradition of the privilege and what it means, as well as individuals not actually using their privilege or fighting for their privilege or feeling like their privilege is better, or not feeling they're better than anyone else, but just that historical baggage of those privileges continues onwards. And then when you're talking to people about it is when you start igniting these self-conscious emotions in people, or at least in the people who care about it. And so this was a set of what psychologists call the self-conscious emotions. They have shame, guilt, embarrassment, pride, hubris. So the bottom two is not what's being triggered, but shame, guilt, and embarrassment can certainly be triggered in these conversations. When you're talking to white Western Europeans, you can certainly be having shame and guilt or embarrassment about what your historical background was in terms of this. And that can be triggered all the time. The fact that your white male can cause these things in shame and guilt, or what did you do about it? And what have you done about it in your life? I know, for example, feeling these complicated feelings when I get a job in a department that is extremely white male dominated, but I'm a white male, and I know that, so it wasn't a female of color or someone else who got this job in the department. But then on a personal level, this is then causing me shame and guilt. And then I want to know how much was that because of my inherent privilege. So I think that gives us a lot of baggage from both sides that we have to talk about how do we think about these things on an individual level, not just on a collective level? Because we can think about in a astronomical community that is still remains white male dominated, especially at the top levels. But if we look at each individual, how many of those were actually using their privilege because of that, or how many just were there as more an accident of that privilege? So if you've got thought on now, that was provoking, so you should have thoughts about it and discuss them. If anyone wants to say anything about that. I mean, there are white males here who've had careers in astronomy, and there are people who aren't white males who've had careers in astronomy. So please comment your thoughts on that.
Well, what's the question, Jake?
Really, how do you feel self-consciously about what happens then in astronomy as a field, in terms of you being a white male or you not being a white male?
Well, to be very blunt, my personal perspective is I've worked really hard, and I'm also pretty talented, and I made it pretty far. So it must be very, very hard to make it this far if things haven't gone smoothly and if you haven't had a lot of luck. That's my personal take on it. So I don't personally feel guilty to be where I am, because I feel I worked very hard and I'm very talented. But it makes me also realize that it came along with a lot of luck as well, and things could have been unlucky. And then if you're less privileged and you have less luck, then you have no chance, basically. That's my personal perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's a good triggering use of the word luck then, and how the luck plays into the privilege card.
Well, some of it is luck in terms of privilege. Some of it is luck in terms of luck, like, analyzing a data set and finding something that was there, didn't have to be there, that kind of luck as well.
Yeah, so Veronica posted in that she's on a bus, but posted in the chat, she's on a bus. But there's a lot of feeling for some women astronomers that we're maybe diversity hires and don't actually deserve the position. So I think that indeed can be a situation that happens on the flip side, is people don't want to feel like they're just being hired there because just being hired there to fill in some diversity card, right? Yeah, Ralph?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting conundrum, right? Because sometimes when you know that the scale is tipped one way, you can't help but try to tip it to be a bit the other way if you want to fix it. And I quite a few years ago, at least a decade, I think, we had an interesting evening discussion about that at the astronomers conference, the Dutch astronomers conference. There was a Swedish speaker, I forget his name, a physicist. And at some point, the discussion came about priority hiring and things like that, and how to change gender balances. And he said, when somebody asks me, should we put a quota system in place or not in order to improve the gender balance in the department, his response used to be, maybe somebody could first argue with me about whether or not there was a quota system in place when I got hired as a physicist in my department, because in fact they were only hiring white men. And of course, you then get into complicated discussions about, yes, but maybe that was not the department's fault because that was the only type that was available. But that's actually usually not true. It's certainly true there was an oversupply. I think I think this is something, I don't know, it triggers many emotions in me, and I always have the feeling if you're not willing to push in a direction that goes against where the push used to be, then you can't fix things. Or at least you can only fix them very slowly.
Yeah.
And then indeed the question comes, how do you make sure that people who then get hired do not feel, as Veronica articulated, that they were only hired because they were not white men?
Yeah. And Betsy?
Yeah, well, I think this is interesting because I was a diversity hire in the sense that the position I was hired under was for women, was to recruit women. But I've never had this issue so much for myself that Veronica raises. And it's exactly because of this talk that you were talking about, Ralph. I remember this talk at the NAEIC. There are so many studies that show that when CVs are evaluated, and you change the name, so you change the gender, or you change what group of people, other underrepresented minority, what race you might think this person is from, that the evaluations change. And so for me, it's so clear that the deck was stacked against me that I see the targeted hires as making up for that. So I don't personally deal with this issue, but I understand why it is isolating for people when they're hired under specific schemes. But I think you have to kind of do it, it's a tough one. And I think the question is not should you do this or not, but how do you make sure the people you hire that way are supported? But even then, even you do something like this, and I was hired to this position, I have no issue with that. I still will have guilt over it in the sense that, I was hired, but I'm still a white woman. So I still carry, a lot of privilege in these positions that target women. A lot of studies have shown they're really good at helping white women, but they're not good at helping other women. And so, yeah, it's complicated and a mess. And you can feel bad that you have one of these positions, either because then you worry about it, or because you'd be like, but maybe I'm not deserving enough of this position in the sense that there's someone who is more underrepresented than me, or
Yeah, so I was thinking about that issue a lot when making this talk originally, is that the last point you made first, this sort of race to the bottom that you can do of who is the most underprivileged person that we can get down to, because you can keep trying to find less and less privilege. And so I think that's, as you say, a sort of unhealthy way to go, though it is certainly worth noting, as you're saying, that it's very true that like you're just like category 1 down the list, right? That you're a white woman, and those programs don't help people further than that. We had an interesting thing with the American Astronomical Society meeting. I was on the committee for the Roger Doxey Prize, which is for PhD students to go and present their work at the meeting. All they have to do is submit their meeting abstract, and then the committee selects the best ones that get to come to the meeting for free. Firstly, it is vastly underrepresented in who is registered for the AAS meeting in the first place, and then even worse on who submits their abstracts to win the prize. But taking that into account, back in the day when we looked at name, institution, and abstract, the choices matched the demographics of the submissions very precisely, not on purpose, but with a very good match. When we stopped letting people see the names and institutions before judging them, the number of women selected went up massively disproportional to the number of women applicants, because women are way better writers. So if you're all just choosing that, and this comes back to primary education and genetic human brain development in terms of writing and language skills and mathematical spatial skills in boys and girls aged 3 and 4 years old, that then perpetuates all the way through, because you've been taught everything at the wrong time from then. But so the women do much better if you're just judging on writing, which was very interesting to see. It was also interesting to see how unbiased everyone was in terms of the demographics of the submission to start off with when you could see the names. Which means your unconscious bias is huge, because you're able to do it on the level of small number statistics. Tana?
One thing that some of these comments have also just raised this thought again that I wanted to bring up. Sometimes this idea of luck and privilege is so, it's very systematic, right? And we're talking about our personal experiences. And sometimes these things are so entrenched systematically that we don't realize that there is an actual biased system at play even. Because like you said, you're mentioning things about educational attainment and things like that that start when you're very young, or the luck, like we always talk about, and I've spoken about this before with myself personally, becoming how I became an astronomer. Luckily for me, I was doing astronomy at the time when there was suddenly a lot of money available due to SK South Africa. So I had, so I was in the right place at the right time in terms of where I was in my studies. But my biggest stroke of luck, I would say, was having middle-class parents who were extremely supportive and who also went to university. And so I didn't have to fight those battles. So there's a lot of, and luckily for me, I was born only less than 10 years before apartheid became illegal in South Africa. So that didn't have as big a catastrophic impact on my education as it could have had. So there's this kind of random luck, like, that I was born in the mid-80s and that I was born to the parents I was born to, etc. But there's also luck that is luck in inverted commas here, that is generated by systemic bias and systemic privilege being perpetuated and keeping that in place by people who have power. They want to perpetuate that power for them and for people like them. And that's a big problem that, we run into in EDI work in astronomy, because of course the people that benefit the most from how things are, which isn't a great system, are the ones that have the power to change it. And why would they change it if it's working so well for them?
If they want to make it work for the society and be enlightened, but we'll get to that maybe one day. But I agree totally about the luck/privilege interface is indeed complicated. And as we see in the world, in every aspect of society, you end up having a lot more luck the more privileges that you have. So that you can do some statistics on at some point. Oh. Oh, and then we just have the quote from Yoda that we should always make: fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. So you should always be bearing that in mind through day to day, that when people, both those senior people Tana was talking about and junior people, as soon as people are put in a situation where they're feeling scared of doing things, scared of change, scared of being accused of things, that starts leading to anger, starts leading to hate, starts leading to suffering. And this is where people can close down and not be able to have these conversations like we're trying to have right now, because you're too worried about what are the consequences of this conversation. People who've seen any talk that I've given before see this slide about how we, a lot of times in astronomy, tend to do this minimizing thing where we try to bunch everyone together and be, astronomy is all beautiful and happy and everyone can be an astronomer. We're all one community and everyone's welcome and everyone can be here and everyone's the same level of astronomer. But actually, we should be thinking about how we're making sure that everyone is integrated in astronomy instead, no matter what your background, privilege, experience was, and how we can take all of those different things into account in terms of all of those aspects of diversity that we ever talk about: socioeconomics, mental health, different family situations, different physical disabilities, all of those kind of things mixing together into this, what do we mean by people being part of the astronomical community, and how instead of just saying we're treating everyone equal, so it doesn't matter what your background and everything was, accepting that it does matter, but how do we make it so that everyone can still be connected to this community from wherever their culture and community is from the outside. And so with individuals who are all over the place in here, every single person can draw their own little bubble map of where everyone is and everything is, and workshop versions of this. We do this where you have to do this for yourself, but the point being that, as I think a lot of speakers have said in the last seminars as well, the main issue that you should address here is that astronomy is actually done by people. It is not done by astronomers. There's no such thing as a astronomer as a class of person. So it's done by people. So we need to have made sure that instead of trying to integrate people's different backgrounds into a minimalized system where we don't discuss that ever, that we appreciate everyone's different, recognize that that's all important, then understand how different people get there in different ways, and how privileges that people had were making it easier or less barriers, and how we can then move the barrier so that people are on a more equal ground. And I'll talk about that a bit in a different, while we were talking about the tangled web we weave personally, but also we have this web on the internet, which also gives us lots of things. I've used this Google Translate example lots of times, so many times, in fact, that Google now seem to have upgraded their translate. So now tell you when they're doing gender things in the translation. But this is always fascinating if you've in Turkish, which is a very gender neutral language compared to English. So basically you're saying they're a doctor, they're a nurse, they're a scientist, they're a teacher. But Google Translate, being a believer in American English and believing that everyone must have a he or she and you can't use the singular they, that this translates they're a doctor to he is a doctor, she is a nurse, he is a scientist, she is a teacher. So now, brand new, Google have introduced some of the sentences may contain gender specific alternatives. So you can be in hope of that happening. But even in that translation, even from a gender neutral language, we're built in society that these things are there, and that this just promotes it in people's minds all the time as you're going through all the time. And the picture on the bottom right is a picture of facial recognition by AI. And if you talk to people who are looking at EDI issues in artificial intelligence, a really big problem is that the seed training for most facial recognition technologies comes from a very few sets of long ago data that was used at the beginnings of AI. And so facial recognition is much better at recognizing white, Western European, and then male faces in that order than it is in recognizing anybody else in the world. So that is biased down at the seed level of all the machine learning that is learning now and still now in all of this artificial intelligence stuff. And you can see it even on your phone if you have your Google Photos album to do facial recognition, to group people together by people you know. That in my experience, again, working with people around the world, in especially with the West Africans, it is very much more confused about who different people are than it is about my friends from the UK, where it has much less problem, including my nephews in the UK who are now aged 5 and 7 years old, but still can take their baby photos up till then and recognize it being the same person as an individual. So the training is way out of step in that way as well. So this is now like a internet generation privilege as well in that kind of background, which also nothing we can do about easily, but to think about. Talked a bit about giving a helping hand, and this is really on that issue of what we think about in terms of how you're going to support this, and not doing the things like necessarily doing unsupported positive discrimination for people getting places. And also what I say here is avoiding allyism, which is a big thing that the LGBT community argues about all the time, that everyone always wants to be an ally. It's very easy to say you're an ally. There is online an astronomy out list, which is a list of people who are out who in astronomy and want to be on a list, which also has an ally section. So you don't have to be out, you can be an ally and also be on the list. There are a lot more allies than there are out people. So every LGBT astronomer should have more than one person out there looking after them. And in my experience, I never met those allies. But the point there being that it's very easy to say you're an ally without thinking about what being an ally means, how we help this system. And that comes back to this breaking the boundaries down so that those unearned intrinsic privileges don't make as much of a difference when we're moving forwards as they had done in the past, but that you're not giving this handout, you're not giving this step up, you're not giving this, okay, we know that you've got less privilege, so now you should be having more rights, but making sure that those barriers don't exist instead. And I think that's the complicated part here that we can have some more discussion about in terms of how do we see making this help happen so that astronomy can be a more neutral situation where we appreciate everyone's background, but we don't necessarily do that. As Veronica was saying, we don't do those diversity hires, but we find better ways of changing that so that you're recognizing that it's much easier through your life to have got to this point if you were a white Western European heritage male. But then how do we fix this system? Now I'm looking at Ralph because he looks stressed out, so maybe he'll say something.
No, not at all.
So any thoughts on that issue of, from any side, of what about this help and support and how do we do this? Veronica says in the chat, aggressive public support of marginalized people. Yeah, Jason?
Well, it's somewhat related. I've heard you say a few times like this side or that side, but it seems like this is a very multi-dimensional problem to me.
Yeah, I'm not really meaning two sides. People who think they had a particular privilege and people who think they didn't have a particular privilege.
Yeah, but it's of course like a whole spectrum.
Yeah, and then as Betsy was saying earlier, you've got those, you know, how many privileges do you tick and how many privileges don't you tick?
Well, there's this nice, I can't remember what it's called, this nice kind of like, it's like one of those spider web plots, right? Where you can see how close to the center are you of the diagram, right? And certainly if you're a white, straight, male, upper class, you're pretty close to that diagram, the center of that diagram.
But
yeah, I
like,
think in general, the issue of allyism is an interesting one, right? You wouldn't actually want people not to express support, but you are right that just putting your name on the list is a reasonably empty gesture. And there is the good old virtue signaling, even that something darker might be hidden behind putting your name on a list. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that has been concerning us a lot of also, of course, in NAEIC is in the end, we want as much as possible to actually give pragmatic and practical help and make things better, as opposed to theorizing about things. And so, you know, putting one foot in front of the other every day is also sometimes a nice attitude as compared to having very long-term lofty goals.
yeah, Jason.
Well, one of the slides that you showed I thought was quite interesting, because you were talking, you had on one side you had kind of, you know, astronomy community with you know, we accept everything, you know, the minimization slide, and what it reminded me of a bit, because I'm Canadian, is there's kind of this philosophy in Canadian governments that since it's a multicultural country, that it's kind of a patchwork. The culture of Canada is a patchwork of all the cultures that constitute Canada, which is very different than the American philosophy of a melting pot, where we have like, this is the culture and you get subsumed into it. And I think in terms of like, in terms of making space for other people in astronomy, like having the mindset that astronomy, the culture and the ways of being an astronomer are by definition the different things that people bring to the field, is I think a more productive way than thinking of this is the definition of what the field of astronomy is, and we need to fit people into that box, as opposed to doing things the other way around, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's indeed, I mean, I lived in the US for 20 years, so I have the experience of the US melting pot idea, except not actually a melting pot. And then Canada's much more, I think, sensible way of that there's a lot of communities there together, whereas the US, as you say, believe on paper that they're a melting pot, I guess. But if you ask an American, where are you from? They will tell you, oh, I'm German, or oh, I'm Italian. I'm, even if they're 5th, 6th, 7th generation from there, still very, very connected to that different backgrounds. And having that big sort of debate there. And then also, well, they've got other problems because they're a colonial empire that then got independence. But that's Britain's fault. So I'll have some guilt. And the Dutch. Yeah, Ralph?
I think in the end, in that story about supporting people to be members of our community, also are going to lie eventually some of the most difficult discussions. Because I think in the end, there are things you need to be able to do as an astronomer. And so to some extent, it's a bit like in healthcare, where you start with the principle that every life is important and you try to save everyone. But then in the end, you do end up having to make choices about how you spend finite resources to do something, right? So in the end, supporting somebody fully to be a member of the community, if that means helping them overcome certain things, comes at a resource cost. And that means that in the end, the number of people you can help is finite. And
yeah,
so
and I think though there's definitely two different issues there, which is totally on the first side, yes, because this is the same as like as you say in healthcare, like who do you give the liver transplant to, right? Because you've got a finite number of livers and who do you decide gets the liver? We have the finite number of jobs in astronomy, and who do you give that to? And you want the people who are most qualified for it. But then you need to look at then the problem comes, where does our responsibility as scientists stretch downwards to make sure that people are getting the same opportunity to get here? Because if I'm saying, okay, I only care about undergraduate admissions, and then I'm not worrying about before undergraduate admissions, what they've had in high school, whatever else, they can send me an application and I will judge them completely based on their application. But then that comes with a lot of baggage, right? Because it's, you know, their primary school history was important at this point. So, I mean, as you say, it's impossible to answer these questions, but yeah, that's your problem there. But I think on the other side, in terms of that, making people feel welcome should be flipped around a bit, to be making sure that how we talk about that astronomy culture and astronomical community and community of astronomers is welcoming for everyone, and not like, yes, I'm welcoming you, oh, and now you're here, I'm welcoming you, and now you're here, I'm welcoming you, but should be like, yes, this is possible for everybody. So you can look at, people can aspire to become part of the community by knowing these are the things that are needed in terms of your mathematics and physics ability, for example. These are supports we can give you to get there, but you've got to get, but once you're there, everything is open, because we are a field that appreciates, you know, if you're a single mother, then you can become part of this community, because we're open to that. If you're blind, we're open to that, because we have these ways of doing that. If you're physically disabled, you can still use a telescope, because we have this and this, which isn't necessarily very much the case. When I broke my leg, my best story personally is when I broke my leg last year before last. Getting into our building was impossible using crutches, because the card reader on the door only unlocks the door for 3 seconds, and by the time I've got my card out, done the card reader, then the door's locked again. So even me could not get into the building. So there's like every single little step like this, even though now I haven't got my broken leg anymore and no one else has got one currently. Well, Geen van der Wegert has a broken hip, in case you know, but he's not trying to get into the building. But that's those kind of issues, is like you need to make it accessible for everyone, especially for the people who aren't there, because always you can be looking at who is trying to get there, or who is here, but you also need to worry about how are you making sure it's accessible for the people who aren't there.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes as another part of this, giving a helping hand, was saying as well, this is a lot of times when you're asking people for demographics or information on forms or whatever, to say, like, yes, because this comes to the diversity hiring thing, like, why do we need to know if you're male or female, or why are we making you declare like that? If you notice that IAU has now given you your gender spectrum choices, so you can be anywhere on a gender spectrum as an IAU member now. But otherwise, why do we need to know all of these things? And it's because, okay, we want to make sure that we're being accessible gender-wise. Okay, that's a good goal, but how are we using that information? I know for applications for research experience for undergraduates in the US, which are funded by the National Science Foundation and have to have a majority minority students in them, you ask for all of these categories to define people, and you can tell based on people's names, all the people who say they prefer not to disclose their gender and prefer not to disclose their race are the white males who think that they will not get into the program if they describe it. So you're actually doing sort of the flip side of this collecting information. Veronica.
I was just gonna say there's been like a lot of issues with people like who don't typically think about diversity and things, saying, you know, we don't have that here, so we don't need to make an accommodation or an adjustment. Like I was literally talking about, like, I was asking if the new building would have like a breastfeeding pumping room, whatever, for, you know, whatever, like 5,000 offices or whatever is going to be in the stupid Faringa building. And yeah, the secretary I asked said, I have no idea, but, you know, we don't have enough space for that. And then someone else came by and said, there's no babies at the Institute. And I'm just like, okay, but that's not the problem. And there are, but you don't know. It's like, if there are, you don't know, it's because those people are at home.
Yeah.
That mom is at home. She's working from home because she has to feed her baby often. And like, okay, but it's literally a barrier. But people see that they don't see a problem, because one, it doesn't have to do with them, and two, it's like that the problem is such a barrier that you can't see it.
I have that in my in one of my other EDI talks, exactly that point of saying you have to look at who is not is there. And in that picture where, you know, you've got the people standing on the boxes, you're going to see it in a second, looking at the baseball game always, sometimes soccer, if it's mine, then you're looking at them from the back and you can see who can't see it, but we're actually on the front side of the fence. And if you're looking at the fence and you can't see this person on the other side of the fence, then why are you doing anything for them? And so entirely that point that you want to make sure you are worrying about what privilege you're insisting people had when they're coming into your building or into your work environment on every level like that. Exactly.
Jake, maybe as a small point of order, we're now about an hour into the time.
Yeah, I'm on nearly at the end now.
We should now give you the opportunity to kind of finish your argument, and then we can go into general discussion about everything you've said.
Definitely. We're at the very end parts now.
Okay.
So the last bit is just like who's judging justice, which is who's feeling neglected or what. And this was in an article in Forbes magazine about anti-racism, and let's clarify white privilege. And just between this example is that the white privileged person has apparently got all of these boxes and the other person doesn't. But then when we're in EDI talks, as I was just mentioning this picture, we've got always these people looking over the fence, and the person who needs more boxes got more boxes, even though this was not equitable, but it was making everyone be able to see over the fence. So then is this person more privileged because they've got more boxes? So always in this complicated situation, you're looking at what is the privilege? When did you get the privilege? This person then got this extra privilege to be able to see this game that the other person didn't get. So this is when you start having this debate again about who are you hiring and not hiring, and did you do those kind of privilege-based hires maybe, or when did you give the support so that people could get there without having to need it at the last moment? So talking about the P word, this is a cartoon seen a lot, which people find very hostile on some categories, because the argument here, what's the problem? It's the same distance for this race. And the argument here is actually the opposite of privilege, because this is this is having less barriers rather than the privilege that you had. So both of them should potentially have had these privileges, have had these barriers, and just this guy's privilege had let him remove the barriers and hadn't had to deal with as many of the barriers, or they had not got in the hurdles on the way to the finish line of this argument. And so how this perception comes back and forth across the community can be really important, or this whole struggle of then your backpack of privilege, which is like I alluded to a bit, Betsy was talking about a bit, that, you know, even though like I'm a gay male, Betsy's a woman, but it's like you're still we have this whiteness, we have this Western European heritage, we have all of these things. So then carrying around this backpack of all of your privileges. So then it seems like a struggle that you've got to deal with in some ways. So somewhere in between these two perspectives, you want to end up with a situation where that privilege doesn't matter so much in there. So then coming back to that first question, why it's so hard for scientists from non-underrepresented backgrounds to talk about EDI issues. And I think we've been through that, and that's what we can now have a general discussion about at the end of the talk.
Okay, well,
I promised it was going to be then.
Okay, well, thank you very much, first of all, Jake, for this very nice talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, who may I give the floor?
I should say too that some people think that my t-shirt is breaking down barriers, or some people think that I can only wear this t-shirt because I'm an overprivileged white male and can be confidently wearing a t-shirt that says birthplace, earth, race, human, and all this love. So you can discuss that too.
All right. Yeah, so I guess we have in some sense not yet answered the crucial question. How do we talk about these things in a way that is non-confrontational? I think it remains hard somehow.
The problem there comes in those middle slides of those self-conscious emotions, because it's almost impossible to have the conversation in a non-confrontational way, not because you're having it in a confrontational way, but because the topic makes these self-conscious emotions happen in people, which triggers you to feel like you're being confronted.
Yeah, yeah. Tana.
I wanted to say, to encourage, first of all, the rest of the audience to feel free to, ask questions, make comments. I'm sort of a low priority commenter here because I work with Jake so closely on these things. So please feel free to jump in if you see me asking too many questions, etc. One thing, Jake, I wanted to go back to that picture of the three people with the box looking over the, and you said that, so I find it interesting that you use the word, that you say that the distribution of boxes, or in this case, I guess you could call them resources to support accessibility, i.e. to be able to watch the sport, it was inequitable. And that's sort of the opposite way I would use that word. So yesterday I gave a talk at ESRON where I used a very similar image, but also with one next to it that was, and I also always use soccer.
Yeah, I made soccer players.
Yeah. So to illustrate the difference between equality and equity. And so this would be the image for equity, because the idea of equity is giving people the resources that they need, whereas equality is giving everyone the same resources. But everyone doesn't need the same.
I have another slide of that in another talk where it does that exactly with those words from my talk and those words from your talks, and the difference between them. And then also, if you translate them, if you translate equity, equality, justice and inclusion or something, translate them into Dutch, then translate them into French, then translate them back into English, then you're left with the same word at the end. So
that's,
I think it's very important that you, that you specifically say what you mean when you say the word. So here I'm using it as a devil's advocate example of saying that is you being able to get that stack of boxes a privilege, and that matches with the working class white boys, for example, who don't have access to any of those boxes for completing their secondary education compared to almost any other. So it's sort of like, where is your privilege? Because your privilege is that you've got a lot of boxes, but you could have got a lot of boxes in different ways. And some of the ways were people helping you because you didn't start off with a lot of boxes. Does that make sense?
Yes, I see what you're trying to say, but yeah, I guess just the clarity of the words, and then I would also say that the devil doesn't require advocacy. The devil appears to be thriving. So,
Yeah.
but I do appreciate what you're trying to get at there. Something that I've started to include in my kind of framework of using that picture as well is that there's two things. One, for instance, which we've already touched on, if you're someone with a mobility aid, you can't be put on a box, right? If you have a wheelchair or if you're on crutches. So the kind of, so not just the amount of support, but the kind of support that you get, it comes back to that equity thing. And then the other issue is the unintended consequences, negative consequences of giving the support. So we need to always make sure that we're staying up to date on these things. Yeah. Because, for example, in the issue of the boxes, what if that child falls off those boxes and breaks their arm?
And it's not a perfect
solution always.
My most important part about when I'm using that is to show those pictures in sequence, but then also flip it around and show it from the other side of the fence, because we're not on, this is a fake view of what we have. We're viewing it from the other side of the fence. And at the start of the day, you just see that one tall guy looking over the fence. So why is there any problem?
And we're making a massive assumption that we are, that we have, that we have knowledge of all the issues that are going on in the situation, which is hardly ever the case.
I mean, your biggest problem is knowing who is not there, because they're not there.
Yeah.
And
the unknowns. Yeah.
Every step that you do in evaluation also only looks at the people who are
engaging with you and there. And who are.
This is, for example, the recent IAU survey of women in astronomy asks women in astronomy the questions. And so you guys, women in astronomy, may have answered the survey, but you're women in astronomy. And so I think also I would like to worry about the women who aren't in astronomy, because they're presumably have different information about it.
Yeah, the women who wanted to be in astronomy but couldn't be, the women who were in astronomy but aren't anymore. Absolutely. Sorry, I think there's another hand, so I'll be quiet.
Veronica's
I've got a bit brain scrambled by all of that. The metaphor has gone a bit far, but actually to ride the metaphor a bit more, I've always thought, like, seeing the boxes and the equity and everything, I thought, oh, okay, that's cool. People would want to help and give support because, at the very lowest level, like, psychologists and occupational researchers have found out, diversity is good for creativity and innovation and all of this. But when I saw it this time, it went sort of directly connecting to what Ralph was saying about the cost of the support. And I had literally never thought of that before, in that, do people who are worried about bureaucracy costs the big bosses, are they sitting there going, well, that little girl can't come because then we don't have money for 2 boxes? Is that literally a problem? Is that a thing?
I think eventually, yes. I mean, assume that a university that lives in very old buildings has to make all its buildings wheelchair accessible, for example. That is a massive expense. And in fact, some laws regarding accessibility in the Netherlands, at least, have been held up by the fact that if you literally want to do that to every old building, you run into monument protection law.
Yeah, but it's like, so Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, at the Columbia University Observatory, which is impossibly inaccessible, but however, does not have to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act because it's historical enough, because they've got a letter from Einstein on the wall.
in the end, these things unfortunately are always trade-offs.
But that's what I'm saying is, you're not thinking creatively. The physical presence say if you're having a problem with students and accessibility to buildings, physical presence is not a thing anymore. I know that it helps.
Yeah.
Like that's why we have in-person meetings ever, but we don't have to have them. This is like a move, like all lectures should be hybrid, or all accessibility doesn't mean that everyone gets the exact same thing. That's like literally the point.
Possibly,
is that you
but
want people
that's,
to have access, and then not that they have to be able to get into a building and go up some stairs
And I
and blah,
think
blah, blah, blah.
though there, that I think,
unfortunately, that's not what the law says right now.
yeah, and I think
That's a new perspective that recent times may have brought, and that would indeed offer a solution sometimes.
I think that's where the law makes it too hard for people to do what we could actually do, which is to make things in the situation. We understand there are people not in astronomy who want to be in astronomy. We want to have a situation where if you want to be and you are qualified to be, then you will be able to be in astronomy. And we want you to understand as that person, it will be possible for you then. So we don't need to be necessarily ready for you, whoever you are at any moment, but you need to know as soon as you come to be an astronomer that the community is ready to support that for you in that way. So it's sort of, it's not having everything in place to start off with, but having that message that everything will be in place, and timely so, should you be there and qualified and ready to go. The same with, if you have a baby, we'll give you a breastfeeding room.
Apparently not.
And you might not need it till you're there with your baby, but you should know that the facility would allow it. That's facilities though, not the astronomy department, so don't.
Well, the other thing that I got out of that specific conversation was that most Dutch moms don't breastfeed, and if they do, they don't do so for longer than the term of maternity leave. So a breastfeeding room, pumping room is not necessary. And it's such a joke. It's such a joke. Like, okay, so you don't do it, but I heard a survey that says that 65% of Dutch people don't wash their hands after they go to the bathroom. So should we remove sinks from bathrooms? Is that something we should do? No, because some people do. So yeah, okay, some moms are going to breastfeed up until the baby's 1.5. You know what? The World Health Organization says that's fine. Yeah. So you need to give them a place to do so. I'm going to rant later.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Other comments, questions, issues to be raised? I'm sure there is more.
I'm sure the issues to be raised is never going to end. So
I'll start a new rant, which is what I've spoken to you before about, Jake, which is that that privilege doesn't average out. And that, like, just because you have some types of privilege does not mean you're not going to struggle. And some people seem to think, like, even from the bottom, like Betsy was saying, I have this privilege, so I shouldn't complain that I have these other struggles. But actually, it's people should realize that the privileges are excellent, but the struggles need support no matter what the other privileges you have. And if you have certain privileges, you need to use whatever power that grants you to help with the support side.
I think, that also goes both ways too, because I think things like, well, Jason now left, so I'll use his name in vain, but was saying that, it's not like any of the senior Western European white males in astronomy didn't do anything to get there. You didn't, there's no like inherited professorships, for example, or anything. So, everyone, that's part of that issue, is like everyone has done something to get there, and the something was extremely hard. Everyone knows how hard it is to get a PhD. It's not like somebody showed up and was like, oh, look, just here it is. This is who my dad is, and look at my skin, and here's my PhD. So everyone has done something. So there's like also that privilege struggle of, which I think is where that starts being pressurized to people, exactly as you were hearing, is that everybody has worked hard to get there. So it's not like, you know, me, I could feel guilty because I got this job and I wasn't a woman of color getting this job. And I know it was terrible statistically. However, I worked hard. And so I got here. And so that's why you have to break that privilege barrier at a different stage than the individual hiring stage.
Yeah, you also always have to realize, indeed, and this again comes to the correlation with guilt, I think, is that appointments in the end are a passive thing, in the sense that you apply for a job, but somebody appoints you.
Yeah.
So if the wrong appointment is made, it's the fault of those who make the appointment,
Yeah, technically speaking.
not of the appointee. And so it's at that level. I mean, you have to make the appointment process better rather than blame those who got appointed. And the reason why they correlate is typically those who got appointed are the ones who now design the appointment process. So
Yeah.
the two things are not uncorrelated.
But there's, yeah, and the accessibility to the appointment process is a big baggage of privilege. Like who is or feels like they're in a position to send an application is a big issue on that side.
Yeah, and there in the end also, I guess, is a slow transition between those things that we can directly influence, like everything that happens in our institutions and what it does.
Yeah.
And we can grab at least one step back. We do active recruitment. So
Yes.
we can reflect strongly about who do we reach out to encourage them to apply to join our world, and how can we help at least deal with the inequities at that level. But you know, the further you go back, the more it's out of your hands, the more you will have to rely on other parties in society to help you fix the problem.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you everyone for the discussion, but I think Ralph is chair, but I think time is nearly up.
Yeah, so I want to call last rounds. Anyone who would still like to raise a point or bring up an issue? Well, in that case, I'd like to thank Jake very much again for his talk and his stimulating engagement with all of us. Thank you very much, Jake, and we'll see you all in a month's time at the next seminar.
Thanks, Ralph.